Welcome back to Cartels, Conspiracies, and Camarena. I'm Jack Llewellyn. Thanks for joining me. To those who celebrated Easter last weekend, to those who celebrated other events over the last couple of weeks, I hope everybody had a great time with family and friends, and hopefully that covers everybody. I want to talk about two recent news events before we get into the topic of the day. The first bit of news is a little bit minor and it didn't necessarily get much publicity, but former Gulf Cartel leader Mario Ramirez Trevino, also known as El Pelon or X20, died in a federal prison in the U.S. while awaiting sentencing on several charges, including the ubiquitous conspiracy, possession with intent to distribute, and money laundering charges. You may remember Ramirez was the leader of Los Rojos, which was the Gulf Cartel's enforcement team or faction. And in particular, Ramirez was in charge of and led Los Rojos during the time that they had a turf war with Los Zetas. Ramirez had been arrested in Mexico in 2013. He was extradited to the United States in 2017, convicted in 2024, I believe, and he was awaiting sentencing when he passed away. The second piece of news involves Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Don Neto. And I'm sure people are tired of me saying this, but this is another example of where you've got to be so careful about the headlines. You probably saw dozens of headlines. Don Neto released. That was the big word, released. What really happened? Well, as you probably know, Don Neto has, for the last 14 years or so, been under house arrest after he was, arrested and then convicted following the abduction and murder of Kiki Camarena. Court ruled that his 40-year sentence had expired, and that therefore he was, quote-unquote, released from the obligations of his home detention. Remember, he got home detention because of failing health. No surprise, his failing health has not improved over the last few years. So again, the truth of the matter is he's not under house arrest anymore, but it's not like he got released, right? They didn't let him out of prison. He's already been out of prison. He was under the house arrest. He's 94, almost 95. He is reported to be in bad health, blind, or close to blind, and having other ailments. In that regards, he's probably never going anywhere outside of his compound, and it is highly unlikely that the U.S. would seek his extradition at this point. So that's big news, right? It's big news when you consider the fact that Rafael Caro-Quintero is in U.S., that he's facing charges in the Eastern District of New York. Don Neto, is, as I said, released. And then you have Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, who is still in prison, right? After having appealed several times for house arrest, given his ill health. And we've talked about this before. I find it interesting if you want to look at justice and if you try to put your thoughts, especially with respect to the Camarena case, of which of those three was likely to have been the most involved or the most responsible for the tragedy that befell Agent Camarena, and which one was the least. And at least from my perspective, with respect to the Camarena case itself, putting everything else aside, the one with least responsibility is the one who is still in jail in Mexico, and that's Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. Of course, others would say the positive side of this is that the one who is most responsible, as some would say, is Rafael Caro-Quintero, who's actually going to face justice in the United States. Don Neto, who some others blame, whether you agree with the release or the house arrest that he was under or not, he did serve a 40-year sentence, right? He spent plenty of time in a Mexican prison. So maybe there's some elements of justice there. But that leads us to the real topic today, or the primary target. And we are going to talk for a little bit about the litigation that was filed on March 20, 2025 in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of California. And it is the case of Camarena versus Caro-Quintero et al. And I want to tread lightly on this, but I want to explore it in detail because it brings into specific relief some issues that I have discussed in the past and thought were significant. I want it to be known before we start at all that nothing I am going to say is intended to be a criticism of any of the lawyers that filed this case on behalf of the Camarena family. Nothing. Okay. One of the primary counsel on the case for the Camarena family is someone who I consider a business friend and, more importantly, a very good attorney. Right? So nothing is a criticism. This is a discussion. And as I said, an example of where we can point to other issues or other concerns. The other thing I want to note from the beginning is that even when you're talking about the cartel people, let's use El Chapo as an example, because he's probably the best example of this. El Chapo was a bad man, right? Can almost all of us agree to that? He did bad stuff. He killed people, right? He passed that legacy on to some of his sons. And yet there's this mythologizing, and other places do it. Pablo Escobar the good, Don Pablo the good. You've got those things. We could go all the way back to Jesse James and stuff of idolizing criminals and things. There is nothing in this complaint that says anything other than what happened to Enrique Kiki Camarena was a tragedy. It was a brutal tragedy perpetuated by bad people. So if I talk about particular issues raised by the complaint, it does not in any way, and never should be construed as in any way mitigating the harm that the defendants did or the tragedy that befell Agent Camarena. I also want to note, and this is going to be very, very important when we talk in a couple of minutes about some of these concerns. The complaint is well written and it's well researched, and a number, I don't know if it's the majority or the vast majority, but a number of the factual allegations in the complaint are footnoted and they refer to documents and pleadings and transcripts from various other proceedings, including but not limited to the 3 prior Camarena-related cases. Remember, there's the Rene Verdugo et al. 1, and then there's Zuno 1 and Zuno 2. So, well done, well researched, well footnoted. All right. So now, with those qualifiers out of the way, let's talk about this for a minute. So, who are the parties? The parties are as follows. So, you have, as plaintiffs, members of the Camarena family. In particular, Mrs. Camarena, both for herself and on behalf of her husband. And then you have Agent Camarena's sons, and you have his sisters. And those are the primary plaintiffs in the case. So we'll just refer to them going forward, collectively as the Camarena plaintiffs. Here's what's interesting to me. Here are the defendants. The defendants are Rafael Caro-Quintero, and it's interesting they list his aliases: Rafa, Cesar El Señor, Don Rafa, R1, El Hombre, 28, the Old Man, El Canoso, El Crespo, and El Plebe. Then they have, also as defendants, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, a.k.a. Don Neto, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, who doesn't get an alias in this pleading, and the last defendant is, listen to this carefully, the Sinaloa Cartel, formerly known as the Mexican Federation, formerly known as the Guadalajara Cartel. We're going to talk about that and why I find that significant shortly. The complaint states 7 causes of action. The one that's particularly important, and I'm not going to go into the weeds on jurisdictional issues, but the one that's significant, the one that explains the timing of this complaint, and in many respects is the jurisdictional foundation for the complaint. Remember, any party that seeks relief in a federal court must show that they have both personal and subject matter jurisdiction. So in order to proceed, there has to be that basis for jurisdiction. The one that's asserted here is civil liability for violations of 18 U.S.C. 2333, constituting acts of international terrorism. And that becomes important because this statute applies to the allegations of the things done by the Sinaloa Cartel or the Guadalajara Cartel to Agent Camarena after President Trump designated the Sinaloa Cartel as a terrorist organization. So remember, when that came into effect, that all of a sudden brought 18 U.S.C. 2033 into play with respect to the Sinaloa Cartel. And we'll talk about what it really was at various times. And that's the basis for some of the jurisdiction in this case. So that is one of the kind of, I'm going to call it the surprise elements of the terrorist organization designation. And kudos to the lawyers at Motley Rice who knew that and were prepared for it and acted accordingly. So in addition to this violation of 18 U.S.C. 2333 for acts of international terrorism, you have some more what I'll call pedestrian or normal personal injury causes of action. You have assault and battery. You have wrongful death. You have a survival action. There is negligent and or intentional infliction of emotional distress, loss of consortium, and civil conspiracy. Okay. The complaint has many, many pages of factual allegations that lead up to the allegations surrounding the kidnapping and torture and murder of Agent Camarena. There are other allegations later with respect to the effect that those events had on the plaintiffs, which support some of the causes of action. But I want to focus on some of the factual allegations from that time period leading immediately before Agent Camarena's abduction and then the events surrounding his interrogation and his murder. And please remember what I said at the beginning. I am not criticizing. I want to use this for discussion. So one of the things that the complaint says, and I mentioned it earlier, is in essence, the complaint says plaintiffs can bring an action against the Sinaloa Cartel today because the Sinaloa Cartel today is a successor in interest to what is referred to as the Guadalajara Cartel. One of the things that the complaint says is during the late 1970s and early 1980s, Caro-Quintero, Fonseca Correa, Felix Gallardo, and El Azul began trafficking drugs collaboratively. The alliance became known as the Mexican Federation or the Guadalajara Cartel. We'll go back to the Federation in a couple of minutes. But here's some of what I find interesting. Page 7 and 11 of the complaint. The complaint says that Caro-Quintero is a founding member of the Guadalajara Cartel. And then a few pages later, on page 11, it makes the same allegations regarding Fonseca and Felix Gallardo. And I have repeatedly espoused the belief that there never, ever was anything such as the Guadalajara Cartel. And that if you looked at the relationship between Fonseca and Caro and Felix and others, and you got to put Coach Loco in there and Javier Barber Hernandez and El Azul, that it would be hard to classify them as a cartel at that point, and really difficult to say they were founding members of anything. And in some ways, it's different than it is today in this regard. Let's say we want to say El Mencho was a founding member of CJNG. Well, we have a little bit more information about that, and we know CJNG exists, right? How do we know that? They proclaim it themselves. They've got the narco banners and the narco mantras and the corridors and the things on social media and YouTube and what else. There never was a point in time when anyone said hey, we are the Guadalajara Cartel. Now, that doesn't, just because you don't pronounce it doesn't mean it can't be. But also go back and remember, if you go back to the first Zuno trial, Lawrence Victor Harrison testified that as much as a year and a half before Agent Camarena was abducted, Felix Gallardo had said, Caro-Quintero and Fonseca are crazy. They're causing too much trouble. I don't want anything to do with them. I'll still deal drugs with them, when it is convenient for me, but I'm not going to do anything with them. To me, all of the hallmarks of a cartel system are missing from the so-called Guadalajara Cartel. And remember, virtually nobody used that name prior to Camarena's abduction, right? The DEA in Guadalajara never used it. Remember, they called them La Familia because there was so much, interfamilial relationships there, but they didn't call them the Guadalajara Cartel. I've had, I bet you, 50 people at one point or another say to me, so what? I got a buddy who I go to happy with another friend sometimes, and we'll talk about esoteric weird things, and he, in a very practical way, will say, so what? So I've had people say, so what? Who cares if it was a cartel? Well, it does matter a little bit, and this is an example where it does matter, right? Some other things that I find interesting with respect to the cartel system. On page 11 of the complaint, the plaintiffs allege that after the arrests of Fonseca and Felix and Caro-Quintero, they add El Azul in there, but of course El Azul's a different story because he's went someplace and did something and probably died at some point, but he's a little bit of a mystery. But it says the cartel devolved into regional-based drug trafficking syndicates. And remember, there's citations to all of this, right? So while plaintiff's counsel is writing some of this, they're just not making it up themselves. But remember what happened. At the time of Felix Gallardo, you had regional drug trafficking all over the place, right? But Felix was the one who got them together and said, we're a hell of a lot better if we respect each other than if we fight. And that kept peace a little bit. But then when he finally was arrested after the Camarena murders, and remember, he was the last one. He lasted until 89. But he also had his lawyer had the meeting where they divvied up everything and said, all right, here's where everybody's going to be. So it wasn't really that things devolved. It wasn't that there was a grand structure that crumbled and everybody, kind of went off and did their own things. There was a little bit of a structure to it, but it also wasn't that there weren't these regional syndicates or regional groups already. The complaint also is interesting to me, and I really want to talk to my friend about this a little bit, because they spend an awful lot of time talking about the Sinaloa Cartel and particularly El Chapo. A lot of discussion about El Chapo and some of the bad things he did and his convictions and the fact that he's at Supermax and those sorts of things. Obviously trying to draw that line from Fonseca, Caro, and and Felix Gallardo to the Sinaloa Cartel today, because that's where you're going to get damages, right? And that's how you have your jurisdictional hook. One of the interesting things for me, though, is thinking about how the Sinaloa Cartel kind of developed. And remember, one of the things they don't mention here is that initially let me rephrase that. So you had the folks in Guadalajara, let's call them that. And after the Camarena abduction and murder, after the arrest of Felix Gallardo, you had several different established groups, right? You had the Tijuana cartel, you had Amado Carrillo, and you had the rest, the ones we've all talked about for so long. And you had some type of discussion of where these groups were going to be. Then later on, there were various alliances, and remember, it was El Chapo who was at least in part responsible for this Mexican Federation, right? The Federation. And that united a bunch of different groups. And remember, we talked about how that fell apart when apparently El Chapo betrayed the Beltran Leyva organization and then started a war. So what's the point here? What point are you trying to make, Jack? The idea that there was a Guadalajara cartel that then became the Mexican Federation, or the Federation, that then became known as the Sinaloa Cartel, to me is not factually correct. The Federation wasn't a cartel. It was an alignment between cartel groups or cartels. And in many respects, though there are elements of that Guadalajara group that kind of ran through to the Sinaloa Cartel, including El Chapo, including El Mayo. In some respects, you can almost say that about other cartels. And so, again, for the complaint to say Guadalajara Cartel becomes the Federation, becomes the Sinaloa Cartel, I think is problematic and questionable. Having said that, in all fairness, I haven't sat down and had the conversation with them, right? All right, some of the other things that I found interesting with respect to this issue. I went back and pulled a complaint, or a superseding indictment, dated February 7, 2020, in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York, and it is the case of United States of America versus Rafael Caro-Quintero, and a couple of others, including at least one party, probably more, that is still under seal. Okay. But what I find interesting is nowhere in the superseding indictment do they talk about the Sinaloa Cartel. Remember, this is an indictment coming from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Rather than talking about a Guadalajara cartel or a Sinaloa cartel, it alleges on page 2 of this superseding indictment that Rafael Caro-Quintero and others were members of an international drug trafficking organization led by Caro-Quintero, known as the Caro-Quintero drug trafficking organization, or more briefly, the Caro-Quintero DTO. In this superseding indictment, talks about the actions of the Caro-Quintero DTO. As I say, it doesn't mention the Guadalajara Cartel. It doesn't mention the Sinaloa Cartel. It doesn't even mention Fonseca or Felix. That, to me, is a more accurate representation of what that organization looked like. Or better said, what that group of traffickers in Guadalajara in the early 1980s looked like. And also remember, I've shared this before, but remember there's a DEA 6 of an informant talking to the DEA, talking about Caro-Quintero and kind of becoming one of the major players. Right? Remember also that at the time of the Camarena abduction, we didn't even have a picture of Caro-Quintero. The DEA didn't have a picture of Caro-Quintero. Remember the famous, scene on the runway at the airport? Nobody knew for sure that was Caro-Quintero because they didn't know what he looked like. The superseding indictment makes it sound more like what you had in Guadalajara at the time was people who worked for and with Caro-Quintero, people who worked for and with Fonseca, and people who worked with and for Felix Gallardo. And sometimes they did stuff together and sometimes they did stuff on their own. That, I would submit, is not a cartel, which is why I've always said the Guadalajara Cartel didn't exist. Okay. A couple of other things I want to go through. And God, I want people to know this. I am not criticizing the lawyers at all. I find this fascinating. And how do we take the various pieces of information we have and try to put it into a structure so that we can understand what actually occurred at the time? And I think it is important when you start looking at some of those unanswered questions. Remember, I focus all the time on the unanswered questions in the Camarena case. One of the ways that I try to solve some of those or think about those is to think about the interaction between Fonseca and Caro and Felix and Cochiloco and Javier Barba Hernandez and El Azul and others. All right. Couple of other things interesting. The complaint doesn't go into details over the interrogations of Agent Camarena much at all. But it does say two things that are contradictory, both of which are supported by citations to a record. So on page 3 of the complaint, it is said that the kidnappings occurred in the middle of the day right outside the American consulate on the streets of Guadalajara. Then, quote, over the next several days, cartel interrogators brutally tortured Kiki and Zavala Avalar in efforts to extract information about the DEA's knowledge of the cartel's operations. That struck me because none of the facts of which I'm aware supports a conclusion or an assertion that the interrogations lasted over the next, quote, several days, close quote. Then on page 16 of the complaint, it says the defendants and their co-conspirators interrogated and tortured Camarena and Zavala for over 30 hours. That I accept far more. I still think, and we've talked about this before and with regards to things that were said in the last NARC and other places, I still think the 30-hour number is hypothesis at best, but that's certainly closer to the truth and the factual allegations. Okay, a couple of other things. And actually, let me go back to the one thing I do want to touch on. So right after it talks about the co-conspirators interrogating Camarena for 30 hours, the complaint says, to prolong his torture, defendant summoned a doctor to administer drugs to Camarena to keep him conscious during the beatings. And obviously, that is a reference to Dr. Alvarez Machine. And I remind people that at trial, the government produced no evidence to corroborate those allegations. The case against Dr. Machine was so weak that it was thrown out at the conclusion of the government's case, and the judge, in ruling on that, said that the government's case was nothing but conjecture. So I just urge you, always, when we're looking at these things, don't take every factual allegation as an absolute, right? And that includes the allegation here, paragraph 50, page 16 of the complaint, that that the Dr. Machine, was there and administered drugs to keep Camarena alive. I want to talk for a couple of minutes about the alleged motive. And motive becomes important here because it has to fit within the parameters of the statute that we talked about, right? 18 U.S.C. Section 2333, Acts of International Terrorism. And to fit into that, what the complaint alleges on page 3 and other places is that the defendants, Caro, Fonseca, Felix, the Guadalajara Cartel, as they call it, kidnapped and interrogated Agent Camarena for the purpose of intimidating and deterring the governments of the United States and Mexico from investigating and disrupting cartel criminal activities. Okay. Now go back and think about everything we've talked about with respect to the motives for the abduction and interrogation of Agent Camarena. There have been two prominent theories presented on what the real motive was. One, which is supported significantly by the interrogation tapes themselves, is that the cartel, see, you got me doing it, that the interrogators thought that there was an informant or a mole in their organization, and they wanted to find out who that informant or mole was. And remember, it wasn't limited to things going on in Mexico. Remember, there was the cocaine raid in Arizona that affected supply of or product that was owned by Felix Gallardo, and the interrogators wanted information about that. As somebody who was in that area at the time said, for whatever reason, the drug dealers in Guadalajara seemed to have the impression that if something happened by the DEA in Mexico, or even as I say, into Arizona, that somehow it was all happening by or at the direction of the Guadalajara office, which simply was not the case. But back to the motives. There was an informant or there was a mole. And then we have the second motive that everybody talks about, which is Buffalo. And in a couple weeks, I'm going to tell you a story about Buffalo, but I can't. I'm still prohibited from talking about it. But remember, the fact that we know that Agent Camarena had virtually nothing to do with the discovery of or the raid on Buffalo, and that he certainly never went undercover at Buffalo and almost ran into Caro-Quintero, as shown in Narcos Mexico. The fact that he wasn't involved doesn't mean that that wasn't one of the primary reasons why he was kidnapped, because if the kidnappers, if the people who wanted the information from the interrogations thought he was involved in Buffalo, that's motive for them, whether he was or he wasn't. And we've talked about that. Even if you want to go to Hector Berreyes and Agent Berreyes' comment that Agent Camarena was picked up because he was about to discover the links between the drug traffickers and the CIA. Right? We've talked about that. We've debunked a lot of that. But, you know, when he says he was the first one to really follow the money and he was about ready to find some stuff, even that doesn't really say that the intent was to intimidate and deter the governments of the United States and Mexico from investigating and disrupting cartel criminal activities. And if you go to the hypothesis that's posed in Narcos Mexico, at least in part, recognizing that it's not a documentary, we've talked about it before. Remember, they have Mr. X and the idea that one of the precipitating factors leading to the abduction and interrogation of Agent Camarena was the Mexican government wanting to get information from Agent Camarena. Well, certainly, to the extent the Mexican government was involved, the goal wasn't to intimidate the government of Mexico from investigating and disrupting cartel criminal activities. Again, I hope that they're able to find information that supports this, that justice is served. But I have questions of how plaintiffs are going to be able to establish that the primary motive, the objective of those responsible for the abduction and interrogation of Agent Camarena was to intimidate and deter the governments of the United States and Mexico. I want to note really quickly that the complaint also says on page 4 that evidence presented at U.S. and Mexican criminal trials proved these defendants, who collectively controlled the Guadalajara Cartel, planned and directed Hickey's kidnapping, torture, and murder with the help of co-conspirators, witnesses, forensic evidence, and audio tapes of the interrogations, describes the crimes committed by defendants and their co-conspirators in chilling detail. And the one thing that I will note, we've talked about this before, and I won't belabor it, but query, if you will, what the role of Felix Gallardo was with respect to the actual abduction and interrogation of Agent Camarena. Right? Was he actively involved in it? Did he know about it after the fact, etc.? The one that I have said, and again, we've talked about it before, the one that we've talked about was how involved was Felix Gallardo really at that point? Some miscellaneous facts that I think are interesting. On page 15 of the complaint, the complaint basically attributes the motive for the abduction to the discovery of buffalo. And I'm just going to read a little bit to you. During 1983 and 1984, Special Agent Camarena and his pilot, I always hate that reference because I think Captain Zavala was much more than that, but Zavala Avalar conducted periodic surveillance flights across central and northern Mexico, studying cartel marijuana growing operations. In November 1984, Mexican and U.S. authorities raided Caro-Quintero's marijuana plantation in northern Chihuahua, which resulted in the destruction of marijuana that was collectively valued at approximately $5 billion. Of course, that's reference to buffalo. According to Mexican co-conspirators, Caro-Quintero learned of Kiki and Zavala Avalar's aerial surveillance and swore revenge against Kiki and his pilot for disrupting operations. So, without getting into the nuances of how a trial will proceed, I think these competing motives may be interesting. And I go back also to the fact that, remember how entrenched some of this information is. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are footnotes to all of this. And there are footnotes to the assertion, the basic assertion in here, that Camarena and Zavala had something to do with buffalo. They weren't involved in the raids. The discoveries that came from a different DEA office. And yet that's what people believe. And it's been said in so many different places at so many different times that it has taken on a life of its own. I also find it interesting that paragraph 48, page 15 of the complaint says that on the afternoon of February 7, 1985, 5 gunmen working for the Guadalajara Cartel abducted Kiki off the streets of Guadalajara. We've spent a great deal of time talking about the actual abduction logistics, and I don't think there's any way there were 5 people involved. Remember, the car they were in was incredibly tiny. But the reason I bring that up is not to nitpick, not to be difficult, but to say how much of the facts we still don't know for sure. For at least a lot of us, there's uncertainty on how many people were involved in the abduction and who those people were, with 1 or 2 exceptions. I mean, I feel pretty darn confident that El Sammy was there. Right? Most of the people I know agree with that. But then you're going to get into some question marks. We're 40 years down the road, and we still don't know who kidnapped Agent Camarena with certainty. One part that was notable for me is the complaint on page 16, paragraph 48 still said that after the kidnapping, the assailants drove 1.1 miles down the street to defendant Rafael Caro-Quintero's home located at 881 Lope de Vega, Guadalajara. 2 things of note there. Remember, there was an issue in the Zuno trials as to whether or not Zuno owned that house at the time, and whether it had been sold to Caro-Quintero or whether there were fraudulent documents, etc. So one of the allegations that I really like in this complaint is that was Caro-Quintero's house. Everybody knew it. Really nitpicking. This one I will nitpick. That from the consulate to Lope de Vega is not 1.1 miles. It's much closer to 2.5, but nevertheless. And then, last thing I want to note is on page 17 of the complaint, it talks about the tape recordings. Page 17, paragraph 52. A search of Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo's residence in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, discovered audio tape recordings of Kiki's interrogation and torture. U.S. authorities authenticated the voices of Caro-Quintero and Kiki and confirmed that the information disclosed during the beatings was information only known to DEA agents. I just want to note, has nothing to do with the case, but just to take a jab at our favorite retired DEA agent. Remember, there was testimony about authenticating the voices of Caro-Quintero. There was testimony about authenticating the voices of Kiki Camarena. And there was no testimony. There was no assertion. There's no notes. There's nothing at all that says there was ever a Cuban voice on the tapes. Never. So the assertion that a certain Cuban agent was involved in the interrogation of Agent Camarena simply is not supported by anything on the tapes. Okay. To wrap this up, I am extremely happy that the Camarena family is going to get a chance to get some type of reparations, some type of damages for what happened to their entire family, and of course what happened to Agent Camarena. And I've offered my documents, my support, any knowledge I might have to assist in that. And I've said that to more than one party in this case. So going back to where I started, I don't find flaws in the complaint, the drafting of the complaint, the facts asserted in the complaint, the lawyers or the lawyering associated with the complaint. What the complaint brings out to me is the fact that we still don't know certain things about this case. There are certain ambiguities that start with, what did the group of drug traffickers in Mexico in 1984 and 1985 look like? How did they operate? And then it goes to who was involved in the kidnapping, who ordered the kidnapping, who was involved in the interrogation, and who ordered that Agent Camarena be killed. 40 years later, and we still don't know. And if this case can do anything to answer some of those questions or add new facts to the analysis, that's something that I, and I know others, will think is valuable and important, and of course secondary to getting some type of justice for the Camarena family. I hope my feelings on that are abundantly clear. And to anybody listening, I reiterate my interest in helping anybody or working with anybody whose goal is to understand the events of February 1985 and the lead up to, the months immediately preceding that better. Anybody whose interest is finding out more about what happened or analyzing the facts in a different way, I'm in, I'm on board, I will help, and I'm going to continue to look at this in the ways that I have. Okay. One quick note before I go. Got at least 2 emails last week from listeners who were complimentary and had thoughts on maybe some other topics. Can't tell you how much those mean to me. Days when I sit here and think, does anybody care? Why am I still doing this? Those lift my spirits like you wouldn't believe. I'm already working on one of them. One of the topics. It's going to take a couple of weeks to nail it down, but thank you again for your interest, and I really, really appreciate people reaching out. All right, that is enough for today. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next week or talk to you next week on cartels, conspiracies, and Camarena. Have a nice week, everyone.